Greetings, Remax Distinctive Agents. This is Dan Bouchard Fernandez. Hope you're doing well today. Got a couple of issues to talk about relating to DC brokerage relationships. If we are going to go in and show any property in DC, whether it is a single family condo, co-op, or an apartment complex where that is managed by a large corporation, doesn't matter. All of those relationships are equal when it comes to brokerage relationships, and we must disclose to our consumers the kind of relationship that we have right from the start. The first piece of documentation that we have to have in place is to have the disclosure of brokerage relationship, telling the buyer what kind of relationship we have. So if we do not have a buyer agency agreement or a tenant agency agreement with this client, with this customer, then obviously we, the undersigned buyer, that would be checked. You would have your name and the company Remax Distinctive here, and the box checked seller's landlord. And that means that you, as the licensee, the buyer is acknowledging that you, as the licensee, are representing the seller in this showing. You must have this form and then signed by the buyer in Washington, D.C. Virginia does it a little bit differently and doesn't require any documentation. D.C. and Maryland do require documentation. So it's very important that we do have that. This is that documentation disclosing that relationship if you do not have a buyer agency agreement. If you do have a buyer agency agreement, then this form isn't necessary until we get into a transaction, an actual lease. So, and then it has a slightly different purpose. And in that case, we would then be filling it out, and we would be checking the box for seller, because we're going to send our disclosure that we're representing the buyer in a buyer agency agreement. And we are sending it to the seller, acknowledging, so that they will acknowledge that you are either representing the buyer or the seller, and then they will sign that here. So that's how that works. Depending on the type of relationship that you have, will dictate what answers get pushed here. At the end of a transaction, you should always have two of these forms in hand. One is the buyer's brokerage representation to the seller, and the other is the seller's brokerage representation to the buyer, and they're signed by the opposite party. If we are going to be in a buyer agency agreement, we must simultaneously get this consent for dual representation and designated representation filled out and signed by the buyer simultaneous to the buyer agency agreement. Same thing goes with the listing agreement. This must be signed with the listing agreement. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. We've got to have that. That's because it's statutory law. We are going to be discussing whether or not we're allowed to be in designated agency. Is this client agreeing to be participating with us in designated agency? And as we know, designated agency is when our brokerage is involved handling the two sides to the transaction, buyer and a seller, landlord or a tenant. That's designated agency when that involves separate agents within the same company. Dual agency in Maryland and DC is obviously when the same agent is representing the same buyer and the same seller in the same transaction. This form is required with all listings and all buyer brokerage agreements or tenant brokerage agreements. So let's talk a little bit about the buyer agency agreement with respect to the class action lawsuits that are happening. Much of the reason why the class action lawsuits have been happening is because a lot of buyer agents have not had healthy conversations with their buyers and describing to them where the compensation comes from and who is responsible for it and who is ultimately held liable to pay it. And one of the ways that this has come about is that buyers agents have often either put a zero in the space where the compensation amount is to appear, or maybe they'll put per MLS. And what this does is it creates a mindset within the buyer's frame of mind that says, the buyer representation services are provided to me free. I don't have to pay anything. It's nothing that I have to worry about, and therefore it's free. The burden is all put on the seller. Well, that's not entirely actually true. Describing to the buyer that ultimately they are the responsible entity for paying their buyer brokerage compensation. Now, the seller may very well go ahead and agree to that, to reimburse them for it on their behalf. And I'd like to encourage you all to use the term reimbursement. The seller may reimburse you for your buyer brokerage compensation. Reimbursing, rather than using the word pay, the seller will pay for your buyer brokerage representation. Say that the seller will reimburse you, because that's truly much more representative of what's actually happening. The seller isn't actually paying for it. They're simply reimbursing the buyer for it. Let's make sure that we get that part of it squared away. If we're going to be FSBO, we have to make sure that we've got an agreement that for somebody to pay the compensation. If the buyer can't make the compensation freely, fully, and pay that out of their own proceeds, then there must be a way for us to be able to have the seller pay that on behalf of the buyer in terms of reimbursing the buyer. So I hate that word paying for the buyer, even though I've used it a couple of times here myself. We need to get ourselves out of that mindset of saying the seller is paying for your buyer brokerage services. We need to get more in the habit of saying the seller is reimbursing the buyer for their buyer brokerage compensation. And we need to also get permission to conduct the transaction. The way that we get the permission from the seller to conduct the transaction, even when we are not representing them, is to use the FSBO authorization to show. So if you've got any questions about that, feel free to give me a call, and I'll be glad to answer any questions that you have. But please make sure that we include that in all of our documentation for compliance purposes, and I'll be glad to help you out. 202-309-2339 or D Bouchard, that's BOUCHARD, at remaxdistinctive.com. Thanks so much.